Hi everyone. This lecture will be on mass violence. It is lecture 2.1. So, in talking about mass violence, we're first going to define the problem. What exactly do we mean when we talk about mass violence? We're going to look at what the data tells us, both because data is always useful and because this topic is very much embedded in emotion. And we also will look at maybe what are some things we can do to try to fix this. So, mass violence is a term that is both a little bit vague and is easily confused with other terms. Commonly confused terms with mass violence are serial killers, spree killers, terrorism, and then mass violence, which is what we're talking about. Serial killers are defined as individuals who kill more than three individuals, typified by highly ritualistic or product-driven motivations. Serial killers often have long periods between killings. When we say, and that's kind of the gorier thing with serial killers, the highly ritualistic, are they killing in a way with very specific means and very specific methods, or product driven motivations, which is almost grosser? Are they trying to turn that body into something? That's really what drives serial killers. Examples of serial killers include Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gasey, and Jeffrey Dahmer. Spree killers, then, are individuals who kill three or more people on two or more occasions with very little break in between the killings, possibly minutes or hours. A serial killer often will go weeks, months, maybe even years between killings. A spree killer kills one person, kills another person, maybe goes somewhere else, uh, kills another person, kills another person, kills another person. Examples of spree killers include Charles Whitman. He was one of the first spree killers, and others. Specifically with spree killers and mass murderers that we're talking about, or mass violence. I don't like to use the names of the murderers because we'll talk about it later. That is actually part of their motivation. Now, terrorism. Terrorism is politically or religiously motivated violence. It's important to note with terrorism that it is not ideologically universal. So there are many, many different kinds of people that commit acts of terrorism. It's not just Islamic fundamentalists. It's not just white supremacists. It is all scopes of ideology have committed terrorism, and that's an important thing to understand. What motivates a terrorist is creating fear, and part of that creating fear is going for a high body count or striking a meaningful symbolic target. So 9/11, the World Trade Center was a very meaningful target in terms of buying and selling of goods on a global scale. Oklahoma City, the Oklahoma City bombing that occurred in the 1990s. There's actually a couple documentaries on Netflix on it right now. That was highly symbolic for the white supremacists who struck it, who felt they were lashing out against the federal government. Now, mass violence, as we're talking about for the rest of this lecture. There are many types of mass violence. Actually, spree killings can fall into the category of mass violence. So let's be specific. Let's talk about school killings, right? So let's look at mass violence that is not in a war zone, because a war zone is also a type of mass violence. Not it's hard to just make the distinction between the two. Usually, when we talk about mass violence, we are not talking about a war zone. We just have to clarify that. Uh, so school shootings, um, and let's exclude public violence that is not connected to an educational institution, such as the Las Vegas shootings that happened, such as the Aurora Batman killings. Right. You may or may not remember that. It's kind of passing into history. School shootings have very specific characteristics and very specific trends that, while they are part of mass violence, can be sussed out, and we can use our data then to understand what's happening there. So, as with all things, you'll remember this from your intro to sociology classes. We can use data to try to get to the bottom of an issue. Uh, if we look at macro level data, we can get what all shootings tell us, and specifically we're talking about school shootings. And if we look at the individual level, we can see what focusing on the shooters, focusing on what the shooters did on that incident will do to tell us a little bit about them. So the big picture, what do they have in common? Weapons used are something that school shooters have in common. Typically, school shooters use the highest capacity magazine weapons as possible, and if they have high capacity rifles, then they will use those. So your AR-15s is currently the highest capacity available rifle on the market. Has been since the Brady Bill passed out of legality. But when the Brady Bill, when assault rifles were banned, those were not what was used. I can't remember I think it was a modified Mac 10. What was used in the Columbine incidents. Anyway, explosives are less typical in these situations. Sometimes mass shooters will rig explosives at strategic points, but often, as especially with school shootings, these are teenagers with a less knowledge of explosives, so that doesn't always happen. When we do get mass violence involving knives instead of guns, there are obviously fewer deaths that occur because knife fighting is actually a highly technical skill, and law enforcement officers or even observant civilians can team up and take out someone with a knife. So that's regarding weapons. Another thing in common on the big picture is that attackers are almost always stopped by law enforcement officers and are often killed. So it is police in most situations that stop these people. It is not civilians who have their concealed carry permit and have a gun in their bag. That's almost never the situation. It is police who stop these incidents from happening, and many times, most instances, the attackers are killed, especially regarding school shootings. So that was the macro level data, the big picture. Now, what can we learn from individual incidents? Well, when we look at the individual incidents, we often see things that dispel myths, right? So in Columbine, when we look at Columbine, the mass misperception people had of Columbine was that these kids were social misfits, that they were bullied and that they were, driven to do this. That's the common cultural narrative we have surrounding Columbine. The reality of the matter is that, again, I'm not using names because that's what those people wanted, right? The common perception was that they were misfits. The reality is that they were actually relatively popular, especially the leader of the two young men was actually relatively popular. So they weren't the subject of bullying or any more than the average teenager was. Bullying is very much a real problem. Don't get me wrong there, but it is not a real problem that is the cause of mass shootings in most cases. Jeff Weiss, I will mention him specifically because that has to do with our readings. He was an example of a shooting as a method of suicide, and this is something actually we do see on the macro scale as well. Many school shooters and mass violence perpetrators are actually using this as a grand way to commit suicide. It's a very selfish way of committing suicide. So not only are they going to go down, everyone else is going to die with them. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in our discussion boards. And then the Aurora, quote, Batman shootings, the individual who shot up a premiere of a Batman movie. This is an example of violence as an extreme stress response. Now, this wasn't technically a school shooting, but it was linked to where we have pieced together. It was linked to the stressors regarding his graduate degree program and having kind of his life falling apart that way. So it was tied to education. And we can see very clearly that it was a stress response, his deciding to shoot up a movie theater. Now, given that wasn't the only reason, there were other reasons involved there. A history of not necessarily mental illness, but mental instability. And we'll talk about that in a moment too. Now, that's what made these cases unique, right? Let's talk more about what they have in common other than guns, right? Guns, availability of high velocity, very powerful rifles definitely does come into play, but let's look at things other than guns. And here is where social factors come into play, right? As social scientists, we can study the availability of weapons, but that's not really what we study. As social scientists, we study social factors, and here's what this is. One thing almost all perpetrators of mass violence, and especially school shootings, have in common is they use or are attempting to use violence as an avenue for celebrity or infamy, right? They are trying to become influential through this thing that they are doing, so they want a high kill count, right? This is why I try to not use their names, because that's what they want. They want us to talk about that thing. They want to become notorious. This is actually, I just got done talking about the things that made each case unique. This is actually something that the vast majority of them have in common. So killers report, or if they die in the incidents, we find writings that find that they desired notoriety via a very high kill count. Killers often also report displeasure with society or displeasure with their position in the social world. So sometimes they will report that no one takes them seriously, I'll show them, blah, 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 that kind of thing. Sometimes they write about how the world isn't the way that they want it to be, and this might be a way to make it the way they wanted to be. Not necessarily their position in the world, but displeasure with the world. And killers can typically be classified as being suicidal. If they aren't classifiable as suicidal, they are typically classifiable as being delusional, because you don't go into staging a mass shooting without thinking that you are going to be killed, right? So with that in mind, how can we fix this? A lot of emphasis, again, especially after in the late 90s, after Columbine happening, was on bullying. And do not mistake me. Bullying is a major problem. Bullying has ruined lives. Bullying has created PTSD in many, many individuals. But it might not be directly related to the incident, right? Columbine is a great example. Those kids weren't bullied. And if they were bullied a little bit, they weren't bullied any more than average. There absolutely are people who are bullied, but those people who are bullied are not the causes of mass shootings. Period. But yeah, the problem needs to be fixed. But that's a topic for another lecture. Gun control. Now, this is something that if we got rid of the high velocity rifles, if we got rid of the high capacity magazines of not only rifles but also pistols, it would stop. It would definitely cause school shootings to become less lethal. They would probably still happen, but fewer people would be killed. And that would be one route for fixing the problem. However, the Constitution is set up to allow people to have these weapons, and there are political parties in power that want people to have weapons. There are powerful lobbying groups, including the NRA, but not limited to the NRA, that want this this state of being to continue, and it's probably not going to change in the near future. So gun control would be a method of trying to stop this, but unfortunately it's probably not going to happen soon. Yeah. Another avenue we could take to fixing this is increased funding to public mental health programs. In the 1980s, mental health programs were cut back dramatically. And because of those public health programs being discouraged and eliminated, we have seen increases in homelessness. We've also seen decreases in the general well-being of the public's mental health. So that might be a possibility. However, there's two factors there. Second of all, we would have to decide as a society that we would want to raise taxes to help alleviate these mental health programs. And unfortunately, raising taxes is very politically unpopular for almost any reason. But not only that, but if we push at mental health being the sole cause of this thing, we perpetuate a stigma of people with mental health issues as being dangerous, right? The dangerous crazy person. And that is not helpful for people who want to try to get better in terms of their mental health. A depressed person isn't dangerous, right? Most people with anxiety issues are in no way dangerous. Most people with mental health issues are in no way dangerous. They're a very small minority of those people. So if we say we are going to build up public health programs to stop mass violence, it might have a negative effect on those people trying to get better. So this might be one way to try to help the problem, but it wouldn't be a very good at all sole way to help the problem. Now, here's something that could help, but there are also issues. If we reduce media coverage of the problem, then we can detract from that whole desire for infamy, right? So I'm going to bump down to the bottom of the slide for a second. If we refuse to refer to those killers by name, then that is a way on the individual level that we can try to diminish that problem, right? If media, if on social media, if we would do this as well, but if our mass media outlets, such as our news channels, such as our big internet presences, refuse to simply acknowledge the names of these people, that might actually significantly help with the problem if it is obvious to those that would do these things that people will not say their names. However, we can't pass laws to say don't name the people, because that runs into free speech and free press issues. And the press are also motivated by what they know people will watch. And people will watch, either out of fear or out of morbid interest, coverage of a mass shooting. So it would be pretty difficult to actually make that change. But with that said, on the individual level, you can do your part by just simply not saying the names of these people. You might refer to the incident as opposed to the actual shooters. Now, this would be a good thing if we could try to increase our mental health options in terms of suicide prevention. This may help with the school shooting phenomena. Not all types of mass violence, but school shooting specifically. Because if we increase funding and attention to suicide prevention, and we destigmatize suicide, so we view it as an illness, we don't view it as a selfish act, we view it as the outcome of years and years of mental illness, the way, and in a good way, that some people are starting to talk about the death of Robin Williams, for example. We will make it easier for people who are struggling with suicide and suicidal thoughts to try to get help. And if we do that, we can both help people who are struggling with suicidal thoughts, which is great to help those people, but also we might be able to catch that very small percentage of people with suicidal thoughts who are prone to commit mass violence 15 years down the road after they haven't gotten help, right? So in this way, we can kind of take a back door to preventing mass violence by helping way more people who are having suicidal thoughts. And that would be probably not the only way to curb mass violence and school shootings, but it would be one way. So that's about all I have to say about this topic. We will talk about this more in our discussion boards, and I look forward to talking to you later.